Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share these slides with all of you here. Tools here. I want to cover up the good stuff with the Zoom heading. There we go. All right, so I am hoping everyone can see the slides. Once again, thank you for the introduction. I am Jessica Fleming, a licensed mental health counselor in the District of Columbia. I'm going to be speaking today about stress, trauma, and violence perpetration, specifically talking about contributing factors to stress, trauma, and violence perpetration and how we can manage and reduce all three. A brief presentation overview. I will be first discussing my research purpose or why I decided to do this research and this presentation and why I chose these topics in the first place. I will then define violence using narratives of violence and facts about violence. I will discuss stress and trauma, how they affect us all, and how we can heal from them, and then discuss the linkages between stress, trauma, and violence, concluding with my hypothesis as well as my proposal for intervention, followed by references. One of the reasons I decided to do this presentation and I chose these topics is because, as I said, I am a licensed mental health counselor in the District of Columbia. So when COVID-19 pandemic began, I was initially working in private practice before I started working with the government. And obviously clients were bringing in a lot of stressful situations. They were having a lot of traumatic experiences. And the rates of anxiety and depression are usually nationally just under 10%, and they rose to just under 30% during the beginning of the pandemic. People were obviously isolated. Some communities were lacking resources even before the pandemic, but realistically, people were not receiving traditional therapy, or at least they were not receiving therapy in the traditional way that it usually is provided. And then, of course, as I was saying, some communities were lacking basic health, mental health, and food scarcity was very popular during the pandemic, but some communities are already lacking these resources. So finding ways of managing and healing stress and trauma in unconventional ways was really, really important during the pandemic, as well as providing strategies for healing from stress and trauma, and also linking individuals' community resources. A lot of stress was coming from grief and loss, a lot of trauma as well. And then people also had food scarcity, like I mentioned, and then sometimes they needed rental assistance. So stress and trauma was coming from a lot of different places. At the same time, during the pandemic, violent crime rose to a 6-decade high, while nonviolent crime, oddly enough, went down during the pandemic. So coping with and reducing community violence became a very forefront of what I was doing, as well as I did a dissertation at the University of Liverpool to complete my Master of Science some years ago. So I also do research on understanding and preventing mass violence. So in general, the reason I decided to do this research and present on these topics is because finding ways of reducing violence and mitigating the effects of stress and trauma have just really come to the forefront of everything that I'm doing at this point in my life. So in order to reduce or prevent violence, we must first try to understand it. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the late, dearly departed Angela Lansbury and Murder, She Wrote, a TV show, without which I probably wouldn't be here doing this presentation right now. So when we go to define violence, I took a definition from the World Health Organization. It says violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So I wanted to break this down into 3 sections. I wanted to point out that the definition of violence that we have here, the only thing that has to be intentional is the use of physical force or power. You do not actually have to intend harm in this definition. A lot of times when people think of violence, we think of someone sometimes trying to intentionally hurt someone. But in this definition, I just want to point out that the only intention, once again, has to be the use of physical force or power. Whether or not you intend for someone to actually be harmed isn't really in the cards. And I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention, because when we talk about narratives of violence, it is very interesting how people define violence in one way or another. So there are often narratives, more narratives than facts about violence, and many of them are around minority groups, substance use, mental illness. It's usually marginalized groups that are subjective to these types of narratives, and there's also usually marginalized groups that are usually have more violence acted against them than they actually perpetrate violence. The article on the left here is describing what's called the Negro cocaine fiends. Basically, this is propaganda from the early 1900s where they were trying to push prohibition against cocaine. They were not only trying to say that if you give Black people cocaine, but also trying to say that cocaine is something that specifically causes people to perpetrate violence, which and then meanwhile, on the right, we have an advert for cocaine toothache drops, which were marketed to pretty much everybody, including children, just 15 years before the article on the left. So it's kind of one of those juxtapositions about um, really what is violence, who is causing violence, and what really will contribute to violence perpetration. On the next slide, we have some other narratives of violence. We have a newspaper posting on the left saying, talking about the killer drug marijuana, which is really just a racist name for cannabis, which is really what marijuana was called before they started trying to prohibit it in the 1920s and 1930s, which was really in reaction to immigration. There were a lot of Mexicans coming into the United States, and they really wanted to limit that. And they also wanted to say, oh, and by the way, these people, do these drugs and therefore will be violent. So the post on the left is saying that this powerful narcotic will cause you to murder and become insane and cause death, all things that we know now very much so do not happen when people use cannabis. Meanwhile, on the right, we have over 20,000 physicians saying that Lucky Strike cigarettes are not only not going to kill you, but they are going to protect against irritation and against cough. It seems as if they're saying these cigarettes are basically no worse than a cough drop, maybe a cocaine cough drop. But basically, we all know that cigarettes definitely kill people. And this is just one of the things I want to point out about narratives of violence, because which one of these is really telling the real narrative of what is violent? Um, on the next slide, I wanted to discuss one more common narrative of violence, which is mental health and mental illness. And it's not to say that people who use substances or have mental illness do not perpetrate violence, but it's a very small number of all violence perpetration that they actually do. So mental illness is a very common narrative of violence. On the left, we have Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of the Joker in one of the more recent movies, in which I did have an appreciation for the fact that they did discuss the defunding of mental health services and how he did have his mental health services taken away, but then it was kind of went into that common narrative of him becoming like a psychotic murderous killer. And it's just kind of like, okay, the narratives around mental illness are very us versus them. It's kind of trying to they come about in terms of people trying to set themselves away from people who perpetrate violence. Like, oh, it can be someone like me. You have to be completely out of your mind and perpetrate violence. And we know that that is not necessarily true. And on the right, we have American Psycho, who was kind of more of a everyday type of person. I believe he was an investment banker. He had a girlfriend, he had a social life, and yet somehow he became so psychotic that even he wasn't completely sure if he was committing these crimes, which once again goes to that narrative of, oh, they had to be completely out of their mind and have to have psychosis to perpetrate violence, and that is just not the case. Moving forward, I want to discuss some facts about violence, and the hard truth is that sometimes we just don't have any. And the thing is, that is what really allows these narratives to permeate and perpetrate within society, because sometimes we don't always have a motive or an explanation for why violence occurs. Some good examples of this are the Las Vegas Route 91 Harvest Festival killing, where a gunman opened up from the Mandalay Bay onto a music festival and killed 58 people. They really scoured literally the earth for reasons why this person did this, and they really never found a motive or an explanation for why he murdered those people. And the same with the Navy Yard killing here in DC. Happened some years ago. I believe 6 people were killed when a former contractor who still had access went in and murdered some of their former coworkers. They had a lot of narratives and ideas about why he may have done that. Like some people thought he was responding to voices. Some people thought he was drinking a lot. Other people said they had talked to him within the last 2 weeks before the killings, and he was fine. He was, very calm. And so sometimes, and it doesn't have to be a mass killing. It can be, a 14-year-old getting killed east of the river in DC. Sometimes we just don't always get a good answer on why something happens. And that is one of the facts about violence, is sometimes we don't always have an answer. What I would like to do is give some real facts about mental illness and substance use as it relates to violence perpetration. Individuals with a mental health disorder are not more likely to perpetrate violence. They only account for 3 to 5% of all violent crime. People with a mental health disorder are, in fact, 10 times more likely to be the victim of violence. Substance use can increase the severity or likelihood of violence, but it's not a direct contributor to violent intent. So people are when you use substances, it lowers your inhibition, it makes you impulsive, it messes with your decision making, but it doesn't necessarily make you violent. It doesn't make you want to be violent, or I'm sorry, it doesn't give you violent intent. It just makes it more likely and easier for you to perpetrate violence. Being involved in or witnessing violence is a common contributing factor in developing a mental illness or using substances, and stress can cause or contribute to symptoms similar to mental illness or substance use. And I will talk about that in a second. But first, I want to give some facts about actual violence perpetration. So, rates of violence increase when perpetrators have low education attainment, less social stability, and prior violence engagement, whether being a victim or perpetrating violence. Rates of violence also increase in regions with high rates of unemployment and when there is a lack of community resources. Stress, trauma, as well as prior violence victimization can be a risk factor for violence perpetration, and this can have an inverse relationship. So, violence perpetration can also put you at risk for stress, trauma, and future violence victimization. Individuals who perpetrate violence often have symptoms of chronic stress or post traumatic stress disorder, and these facts account for not just community violence, but different types of violent crime. Now I'm going to talk about stress and trauma and how they affect us all and how to heal from them. First, I'm going to give a definition of stress. So, stress is the mental, physical, or emotional strain or tension resulting from a very demanding or extraordinary circumstance. We all carry a certain amount of stress in our body, and that is called the allostatic load. Your allostatic load, or how much stress you're carrying, can be measured in different levels, such as positive, tolerable, or toxic. Positive stress is that type of motivating stress that really doesn't give you a whole lot of strain or tension. Tolerable is when you start to have some of these symptoms that I'm about to talk about in responses to stress. And then toxic is when you have stress that is either constant or chronic that you've been carrying with you. And everyone carries a certain amount of stress, but not everyone manages stress well. And this affects how great your load is. Your load can be due to genetics, prior stress, social factors, or how much stress that we carry is based on how much stress that we have endured over our life and how much stress that we have lost or managed. And pro tip, we all need to be doing something every single day to be managing and relieving stress. Understanding stress. So, stress is not meant to be kept or constant. Many individuals, as I said, have issues managing stress, and stress can become chronic if it's carried or constant without management. And the symptoms of stress, if they are chronic, can become similar to trauma. Genetics, prior stress, and social factors contribute to how stress is carried at any time or how much stress is carried at any time. And I want to talk briefly about adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. These are potentially traumatic events occurring between the ages of 0 to 17, so before the age of 18, that can include loss of an individual, an assault, witnessing violence or a tragedy, and they can lead to toxic stress. So when I talk about stress, it's important to remember that when we have responses to stress, it really depends on not just how much stress we're under, but how much stress we've actually accumulated and not released or managed in our life. But the silver lining is that stress can be managed and reduced for healthy functioning. I'm going to discuss how we can do that. So some of the physical responses to stress, as I said, stress can be physical, mental, or emotional. Can be muscle tension, stomach and body aches, fatigue, decreased functioning of your immune system, dysregulation of your circadian rhythm, like your sleep and wake cycle, and it can also disrupt your your eating habits. The physical response to stress can also include increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, or increased cholesterol levels. Some ways to heal from the physical effects of stress can be breath work, which is just a fancy way of saying breathing exercises, muscle relaxation, yoga, maintaining your health as much as possible. So, eating well, sleeping well, staying hydrated, and exercising, aromatherapy, and nature therapy. And nature therapy can anything from taking a walk outside in nature to playing with a dog. The mental responses to stress can be, and these are not exhaustive lists, but these are just some of the notable responses to stress. So mental responses to stress can be lack of concentration, memory issues, negative thoughts, constant worry, and poor judgment. And some ways to heal from the mental responses from stress are talking it out, but you have to be mindful. You don't want to stress out your friends with your stress. So getting a therapist might be realistic and responsible. Meditation and practicing mindfulness can also help. Socialization, prayer, doing things that bring you joy, and using gratitude to create positivity can be ways of healing from the mental responses to stress. Lastly, emotional responses to stress can be irritability, frustration, mood swings, feeling overwhelmed, and becoming anxious. And healing from emotional stress can look like going to therapy, practicing mindfulness, relaxation for emotional regulation, tolerance, and medication. Now I'm going to discuss trauma. So, what is trauma? Trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological result of a traumatic event that has a significant or prolonged effect upon behavior or functioning. So, stress is something that we usually shake off, whereas trauma is a much deeper thing. If I were to do a metaphor, I'd say that stress is kind of like a scratch. And either you can treat a scratch or you can usually just kind of let it go by itself. And trauma is more like a gash. It's something that's more prolonged. It's something that definitely is going to take some work to heal and recover from. A traumatic event doesn't have to be extraordinary. It can be cumulative in nature. A lot of times people think of trauma as being like a large bomb going off near you, but it can also be something like multiple incidents of gunfire happening outside of your window every day. That can be traumatic. Everyone is going to have a slightly different response to a traumatic event, and trauma may not show symptoms for some time. And like I said, these are not exhaustive lists, but these are some of the ways trauma can affect us and how we can recover. So, first, the physical responses to trauma could be numbness or a lack of association with your injuries, unhealthy coping behaviors like substance use or irrational behavior or impulsiveness, also body tension like headaches, stomach aches, chest tightness, and labored breathing, and avoidance, actual avoidance of stimuli. So, if you had a car accident, you might avoid cars or driving. Some ways to heal from the physical responses of trauma are relaxation techniques like yoga and breath work. If you have a substance use disorder, you can use medication assisted treatment. They have this for different things like amphetamines, opioids, and alcohol. And also, anti anxiety and antidepressant medication are common following a traumatic event. Other therapies can be exposure therapy as well as biofeedback therapy. Some of the mental responses to trauma can be disassociation from the event, a lack of memory of the event. You might have ongoing forward issues with concentration and memory. You might have intrusive or negative thoughts. You may be hypervigilant or hyperarousal, so you might be on edge or thinking something is always about to happen. And you can also have a loss of interest in things that you usually find enjoyment. Some of the ways that you can heal from the mental responses from trauma are perspective. It's a very simple thing, but believing that you can overcome a traumatic event goes a long way. Mental flexibility is also important. You don't want to stay in one mental state. Meditation and mindfulness are actually really good for mental flexibility, as well as therapy, cognitive work, maybe affirmations, positive thoughts, as well as just processing the traumatic event can be very helpful. Connecting with peers and support groups for those with similar experiences. So they have support groups or maybe like survivors of like 9/11 or the pandemic. And they also have just general peer support groups for like grief and loss. And then volunteering is also good because it can help take your mind off of what you're going through and put it onto something else. And then finally, the emotional responses to trauma are having no emotions at all, feeling unsafe or insecure, anxious, depressed, having low self esteem or self worth, or feeling alone or unconnected to others emotionally. And some of the ways we can heal from emotional responses to trauma are therapy for emotional regulation, EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. I have heard great things about people who have gone through that hypotherapy, social support, dietary and lifestyle adjustments. So, different foods, movement, getting sunshine are all different ways where you can increase chemicals in your body like serotonin and dopamine that make us feel good emotionally. And then, obviously, people sometimes take medication following a traumatic event. I know that I had mentioned that perpetrators sometimes have a diagnosis of post traumatic stress disorder. So I wanted to briefly discuss what that is. PTSD affects about 7 to 8% of the US population. It used to be called shell shock because people only believed that you could get it if you were like in a war type of setting. But as we now know, you can have PTSD for a number of traumatic events. PTSD disrupts the regulation of the stress hormone cortisol, and that disrupts the body's ability to regulate the fight or flight response. And that is why successful treatment of PTSD involves regulating arousals to stressors. Symptoms may not be present, just like traumatic symptoms of any type, for some time after the event, but when they do occur in order to have a diagnosis of PTSD, they need to be present for over 1 month. And the symptoms of PTSD include exposure to a traumatic event, intrusive thoughts or nightmares, heightened or startled responses, negative changes in thoughts, emotions, or behaviors, irritable or destructive behavior, problem sleeping, avoidance of stimuli, or dissociation. So now I'm going to talk about the link between stress, trauma, and violence. So, as I was saying, at the start of the global pandemic, we saw violent crime rate rise for the first time in 4 years by about 30% between 2019 and 2020. This rise in violence was attributed to the factors of social economic stressors due to the pandemic, despite the fact that property and other nonviolent crimes actually decreased. So, violent crime went up, and then property nonviolent crime went down. Community violence and some forms of mass violence have reported revenge to be a common motive in violence perpetration. And that's, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt because a lot of times, like I said, we don't necessarily know what the motive is. But violence has been shown to be a common way for victims to attempt to gain control in their lives following a traumatic event. Furthermore, communities with high rates of violence often lack resources to manage or heal from the effects of stress and trauma. And it is shown that learning to manage and heal from stress and trauma from an early point or early age can improve individual and social outcomes and possibly reduce violence. Various modalities, many of which I just discussed, have been shown to assist in managing the effects of stress and trauma that also possibly have the potential to reduce violence perpetration. And so, in conclusion, my hypothesis is that if we do the following, implement interventions to decrease and manage the effects of stress and trauma, inclusive of non traditional methodologies. So, like I said, therapy is great, but not everyone has access to therapy, not everyone needs therapy, not everybody prefers therapy. What I feel is most important is the management, reduction, and healing from stress and trauma. In addition to implementing these interventions, I'm proposing that these interventions are implemented in areas that have high rates of violence perpetration. And then I'm also proposing that policy is created that allows interventions to be implemented in various systems throughout the lifespan at the micro, meso, macro level. So putting things, and these are just some examples, putting yoga, distress tolerance skills, and conflict management in schools, creating community unity, assistance with social issues through case management, and then restorative justice at the legislative level. I didn't talk a lot about systemic violence. I really talk more about interpersonal violence, but there are a lot of laws that are passed that really create a lot of stress and trauma for communities. And so having restorative justice at the legislative level would be good to managing that stress and healing from that stress and trauma. So in conclusion, my hypothesis is that if you implement the proposed interventions that I've been speaking about to manage and decrease the effects of stress and trauma, you may see a reduction in violence perpetration in those areas. And that is all that I had to present on. These are my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, if you guys have questions, please type them and we will address them at the end of the session. And let me introduce our second speaker. So, Ermi Paitnaga from the University of Antique in Philippines. And she will be talking about female officers behind bars, a case study. And I'm happy to give the floor to Ermi.
Okay, thank you, Sana. Good day to
Ermi,
all
we can't hear you.
the attendees and my fellow panelists. Let me
Ermi,
share my
Ermi, the sound is
screen.
I'm sorry, the sound is very strange. When we were talking at the beginning of the session, it was fine, but now it's.
Hi, is my audio okay?
Sorry?
Okay, is my audio okay now? Just a few minutes ago, there was a power outage here, so I don't know if it's because of that, but
Yeah, it's much
thankfully
better
it's stable
now.
now. But yes, okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen now. Just a moment. Okay, is mine okay?
Yes, we can see it. Do you have sound to share as well? No sound.
No.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, I'm going to begin. This is basically a finished research entitled Female Officers Behind Bars. It's a case study. Basically, the content of this study focuses on the female jail officers employed here in our local district jails. So the very main reason I chose them as my informants or participants of the study is because it's very personal. When I was still in my undergrad during my freshman year, there was a group of people from the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology. And they were ones just wondering why there was no female or women officer representing their bureau, even just one. So I was wondering, and then I asked them, their jail warden was a male, so I asked him, why is there no women or female jail officers in that sense? So he answered, we are, I can't really recall his response, but it goes like this. They don't hire female officers at the moment. They do not have female jail officers in their particular jail. So in this study, I'm highlighting the vitality, the significance of female in this in the corrections pillar. So by 1981, only 4 United States correctional systems resisted employing female officers. So thankfully, fortunately, during in the recent years, there are only few countries all over the world that resist employing female as jail officers, mainly because they're saying that female or women gets pregnant, and in turn they are availing this maternity leaves, and it could cause cripple in the whole agency or the whole bureau if they hire more female than the males. Okay, so here in the Philippines, we have the Magna Carta for Women. Basically, it's founded or anchored in international laws. So the Commission on Human Rights here in the Philippines insisted that the Philippine National Police, together with other allied services, they are mandated to increase women recruits to reach 50% 5 years from the passage of the Magna Carta for Women, which is in the year 2009. But my dispute here is, up until now, we are in the year 2022, right? The women recruits or the quota allotted for the female to join this bureau, like the Philippine National Police, and at the same time the jail officers or the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, as we refer here in the Philippines, they still only allot 10% of the overall quota yearly, and that doesn't meet the Magna Carta for Women, which is set by the international laws. So in Section 58, Title 7, of the Republic Act 8551, the Republic Act 8551 is under our Constitution here in the Philippines, which forms the Philippine National Police and all other agencies allied to it, like the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, which are employing our jail officers. They mandated the reservation of 10% of its annual recruitment to women who shall serve in the women's desk. So I like to give emphasis here on this part that the 10% of its annual recruitment were allotted to women, which will only serve in the women's desk, wherein women are a lot more likely have more skills, critical, and more than the administrative positions they deserve. Okay, so later in the results and discussion, I'm going to present to you the findings of the study, wherein these female jail officers were tasked with a lot more than the administrative positions usually assigned to women or the female. So in a study by Campbell, he said that female officers are found to be vital to the profession. Okay, so this were my research questions. First, what are the experiences of female jail officers in the performance of their respective jobs as they work in a male-dominated institution? Second, how do female jail officers approach the persons deprived of liberty? So we refer to our inmates as the persons deprived of liberty. We no longer call them inmates or detainees, but rather persons deprived of liberty. So how do female jail officers approach these PDLs in terms of their gender and age? And lastly, what are their motivations? So the framework mainly is anchored in Hackett and Betts' 2006, The Career Self-Efficacy, wherein its basic premise is that low expectation of self-efficacy regarding various career areas, particularly those which have historically been male-dominated, are a major mediator of gender differences in occupational choice and subsequent vocational behavior. And another is the Crumbolt's, the social learning theory, which I know researchers know as well, that it develops attempts to explain why people make their career decisions they make. Okay, so for the methodology, I have the research materials. Firstly, of course, the 8 female jail officers which served as my informants. Next, the 2 district jails in Antique, namely the San Jose District Jail and the Colasi District Jail. So basically, these 2 district jails are situated in one province here in our area. So I also have the voice recorder as a research material. And lastly, but the most important, the transcription of the interview as the corpus. Okay, so this is how I gathered the data in order to come up with the emerging theme of this study. So first, I secured letter of permission noted by the course professor to the jail wardens. So basically, the jail wardens of the target district jails with female jail officers to be interviewed. So here in our area, in the San Jose District Jail and Colasi District Jail, each district jail has 4 female jail officers only. So they range from 20 to 30 overall population in terms of officers, and only 4 of each jail were female or women. Okay, so next, I've explained to the concerned officers the purpose of the study, basically to the informants or the female jail officers in that sense. Next, I clarified to my informants and the jail wardens as well that the personal information recordings and transcription of the interview would be kept confidential. And after the approval of the permit, the researcher, or me, subjected the female jail officers of each district jail to a series of open-ended questions or interview. So aside from the research questions I've stated formerly, I have also prepared open-ended questions as follow-up just in case the informant doesn't suffice the question. So I also transcribed the responses and considered only those that answers the research questions, of course. So I analyzed the data, formulated open-ended questions to establish the aim of the study. Also, I selected only the transcribed responses that were suitable for the thematic analysis, which was the approach I employed. And then I developed codes at the same time, categories, and of course, the emerging themes. And I hired an iterator within the academe to check the iterator reliability results based on the coding activity I performed. And lastly, I finalized the results of the based on the thematic analysis procedures. So these were the ethical considerations. Firstly, the approved permission letters by the jail wardens, and at the same time, the sanitation of the identity of the persons, organizations, and agencies mentioned by my informants, and at the same time, the informant's personal information. So here I have the results in discussion, which answers mainly our research question. Firstly is the experiences. So it was found out that the performance of the female during acts of violence, their capacity to contain the unprecedented situation, was, what do you call this, was excellent, because some of these female jail officers, according to them, their responses during the interview, they said they were they experienced jailbreaks, they experienced riot inside the jail facility. They even saw with their own two eyes during their duty, during their tour of duty, murder, inmates or PDLs killing each other. And they were even allowed to perform their tour of duty inside the jail facility without a issued firearm. So regardless of these lapses, regardless of this shortcoming of the agency, still these female jail officers exceeded their expectation and performed excellently during acts of violence which are unprecedented. Next, their experiences with non-contact administrative positions. So basically, there are even female jail officers assigned in the operations section or the operations task. So the performance of clerical duties, even their clerical duties in most days of the week, some female jail officers confess that they don't have a day off in the whole month. So imagine how tiring that is, not having a day off, not having a chance to get home to their families, even rest for just a day. So their duties are continuous. So also their experiences, one of the experience was they always feel outnumbered, but at the same time welcome. Not just with their fellow jail officers, but at the same time with the ambience of the inmates or of the PDL surrounding them. Okay, so regarding their approach, physical dominance is not necessary in the achievement of a PDL's compliance. So this was one reason of the policymakers here in the Philippines. The reason of not increasing the quota still, even if there's a Magna Carta for women, basically anchored on the international laws. The reason is that women or female jail officers are not strong enough when it comes to, let's say, jailbreaks, riots, or even small misunderstanding between PDLs or persons deprived of liberty. They say that women do not have that psychological deterrence to the PDLs when it comes to strength, that the policymakers think that the PDLs might suggest that, oh, our duty of the day is a female officers. We can overcome her, like that. But regarding approach of these female jail officers, according to their responses and according to their experience, their approach towards this persons deprived of liberty, whether they're female or male inmates or male detainees, they all agree that physical dominance is not necessary. And this persons deprived of liberty also cooperate when it comes, or when the female jail officer is the one handling them. Next approach is leniency. This is also a discussion between the policymakers, that they think females are not emotionally stable when it comes to the atmosphere of a jail facility, that they will become considerate when dealing with PDLs. And this is true, as responded or as answered by the female jail officers I interviewed. They have sort of a leniency towards the PDLs or the inmates. And they said it's not a bad thing because their leniency is a sort of balance towards the male, which are more dominant and more aggressive when treating these PDLs inside the jail facility. Next, the motivation of the female jail officers to continue their chosen career paths, wherein they understood from the first place that entering a male-dominated institution is, a road less traveled, and what motivates them to continue despite of discrimination, stereotyping, and even belittling their capacity to endure the jail atmosphere. First is income, of course, and they were not hypocrite about this. They answered, firstly, income. Although there's a short quota or very trivial quota for the female here in the Philippines, but their job is lucrative, so they work to earn. Next is personal fulfillment. So their inner desire to render service. Basically, they're motivated to continue their work paths because maybe it's their parents were frustrated jail officers and they want to continue their dreams, and some others where it's really their inner desire to help these PDLs reintegrate to the mainstream society. So in conclusion, the results of my study confirmed Hackett and Betts' account, stating that career behavior is a result of interaction between self-efficacy, outcome expectations, and goals. And the narratives of the informants helped scaffold the policymakers in understanding the presence and vitality of female in district jails. So as opposed to their belief that women are weak and vulnerable, supporting their decision to limit the quota every hiring process. So in addition, the female workforce in the corrections held skills and made contributions to the field, which rendered them as extremely valuable employees. So basically my stand here, or what I'm trying to say here, is that hopefully the policymakers here in our country be able to hear maybe an increase in quota for the female jail officers and its allied agencies, or if better, just remove the quota for female officers and have an equal chance for both sexes to enter the service. Okay, and that is all for my study. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are open to questions now, so please type your questions in chat or Q&A. And speakers can turn their cameras on, since you guys will be answering the questions. Okay, let's see. So we have two questions. The statistic that mentally... I think there is a word missing. Maybe mentally unhealthy, he meant. So there is a question from Portia. The statistic that... I'm not sure, what do you guys think? Mentally, she's missing some word here.
Okay, I think I get it. So basically, I would say it's
Would you read the
asking.
question? Yeah, what do you...
Yeah, so they're asking because of the statistics that mentally ill people are more likely to be perpetrators of violence, even though that's not true. They're asking how that misrepresentation affects their mental health. And I would definitely say it's not good. I mean, we've all, at some point probably seen someone who was like mentally ill or even severely mentally ill, and we were like, we don't really know what's going on. So you can only imagine, what's going on with them when they know that people are probably fearful of them, or going to accuse them or something like that. And then on top of that, they're already dealing with, a lot of mental health issues. So it's not good, definitely. And one of the ways that we can combat that is to combat the stigmas around mental illness and mental health.
Okay, thank you. And another question, how does the lack of female officers impact female prisoners? That's for you, Irma.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Actually, the lack of female officers may have a really huge impact to female prisoners, because when we lack female officers inside the jail facility, the male officers are not allowed to frisk this female prisoners or the female PDLs. No? So only female jail officers are allowed to do this kind of things. And at the same time, to avoid abuse, to avoid acts of lasciviousness and other sexual harassment that may lead to other forms of violence when these female prisoners or female PDLs might give a different meaning when it's the male officers that's doing the basic task onto them. So that's it.
Yes, thank you. More questions? You can type them in chat or Q&A. Well, thank you guys so much. We'll wait a couple more seconds for more questions. Okay, we have one more question. Oh, that's not a question. Yes, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you both.
Thank you too, Oksana.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, so last chance for attendees to type their questions in. Because if we don't have any more questions, we are going to end the session. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And that it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you both.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone who attended.
Bye.